Thanks, Dan, and thank you all for being here on a Sunday afternoon. I really appreciate it. Okay. All right. We live in a secular society, but I want to tell you a slightly more complicated story about what that means than you might have heard in the past. Typically, we think of it this way. I call it the seesaw model. The less modernity, the more religion. The more modernity, the less religion. And oftentimes, that's kind of a romanticized vision, actually, because I think oftentimes that is based on an excessive appreciation of past piety, partly because we read people like Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, Moses Maimonides, and we assume that everyday Catholics, Protestants, and Jews were as religious as those folks. And they really weren't. They just didn't hang out and pray, paint, and obey all day. And it's also based on, I would say, an undue depreciation of present piety, okay? And we can just look at the data really quickly. Oh, and I'm a sociologist, so that's what we do. It's an occupational hazard, looking at the data. But when we think about just institutions, some institutions do die. But on the institutional level, secularization is self-limited because as some groups die, others are born all the time in processes I call religious revival. 50 years ago, people were not expecting a revival of evangelicalism in this country. Now about a third of Americans say they're born again. Religious innovation. Say New Age spirituality, for example, is a combination of a melange of all sorts of different religious meanings, rituals, symbols, and so on. Religious importation, especially since the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act that brought people from Africa, Asia, Latin America, coming with all sorts of other new religious schemas, practices, and so on. And of course, religious entrepreneurialism, and the creating of new religious groups. Mormonism, for example, is a homegrown faith in this country that people thought was going to die with Joseph Smith. But now if you project the numbers of Mormon growth, especially abroad, it looks like it's going to be the next great world religion. And of course, even individually, about 81% of Americans say they believe it. Oh, and by the way, that really does matter. Our eclectic array of religious institutions does matter. So for example, if I produce vanilla ice cream, and only these three people like vanilla ice cream, I'm only likely to convert, pun intended, these three people from potential to actual ice cream consumers. But if I produce vanilla, chocolate, Rocky Road, vanilla swirl, you get the point, I'm likely to appeal to a larger swath of the potentially ice cream consuming public. And the same is true of all sorts of different religious institutions. Conservative, liberal, high church, low church, appealing to different ethnicities and races and classes and so forth. So I think that's a secret of American religiosity and the vitality still of the religious landscape here. And that is, we produce all sorts of flavors of religiosity and therefore appeal to different religious tastes. And even on the individual level, about 81% of Americans say they believe in God. 75% say they pray on a weekly basis. About 79% say they believe in miracles. About 36% who have had a religious or mystical experience. 74% feel the need to grow spiritually. Oh, and by the way, I looked this up. That was only 56% in 1984. So the language, as Dan suggests, of spirituality and spiritual growth has become more important. So I want to complicate this seesaw idea, okay? I think that religion and secularity, the sacred and the secular, coincide in very interesting ways in this country. And I also think that while we're not a traditional society, the meanings and scripts and narratives that we enlist to make meaning of our lives really are taken from traditions, okay? So in order to understand this more complicated story I'm trying to tell you about secularization, I have to trot out a $40 word, and that is to say that we live in a differentiated society. Secularity is tantamount to what we call social differentiation. In other words, imagine a village in 12th century France. We have all this wine, so I'm thinking about the French. Imagine a village in 12th century France. It would be a Catholic village, it'd be a Catholic, 12th century, it'd be a Catholic village. And so you have the usual institutions of society. The political sphere. Yes, but that political sphere would operate according to a certain religious logic. The monarch would need a divine right to rule. The monarch could go to war as they do, but it would have to be a just war, religiously defined. Same is true of the economic sphere. I believe it's called banking today, but at the time, loaning money on interest was called usury and was sinful. And if there were economic disputes, they would be settled in church courts. So even the economic sphere operated according to a religious logic. Even education, get out your textbooks, the Bible. Science, same thing. What you could study was circumscribed by religious norms and so on. Galileo thought he saw what he saw, but the bishops thought otherwise. And even art was religious art, okay? By thinking of secularization as differentiation, we mean that these different spheres of society operate according to their own rationalized logics. Yes, the state exists, but it operates according to a logic of power. Max Weber's famous definition of the state as that institution of society that wields the legitimate use of violence is still a valid definition, okay? The economy operates according to a logic of profit maximizing, or at least satisficing, okay? Education, sadly, based on a logic of credentialism. Getting your degree and so on. Science, based on a logic of empiricism. And art, of course, a logic of aesthetics. So the Catholic bishops didn't like Andres Serrano's Piss Christ, photographs of a crucifix and streams of urine, but the MoMA liked it quite a bit, and that's what mattered. So rather than religion being hegemonic, steering the different institutions of society as it once did, it itself is a distinctive institutional sphere, independent of these other institutions, that operates according to a logic of spirituality or salvation or whatever you want to call it. Now, having said that, think about it for a second. Untethering religion from the state means there's all sorts of religious pluralism and choice without necessarily any one legitimate way of valorizing the legitimacy of one choice over another. Those different institutions operating according to their own logics it defines the self differently from us. Is there any wonder why we wonder who we are? We're operating as citizens, as consumers, as churchgoers or not, as educators or students and so on. So these different logics really do fragilize our sense of identity. So I'm just thinking for a second, even the term the identity crisis was only coined in 1965. Most people, most places, most times didn't have identity crises because they didn't have a lot of choice. My grandparents grew up in Western Ireland. They were shepherds, and they didn't have an identity crisis. They were the sheep. They figured it out rather quickly. But now we have all sorts of options, religious and otherwise, that define a meaningful life. And it becomes really difficult to adjudicate which is superior to the other. Okay? So there's a problem with selfhood here. Okay? But I would add, here's the only kind of heavy lifting analytically right now. And that changes what I described, secularization as differentiation, changes how people engage with religion now. Okay? And the way I try to put it, I try to disaggregate by level of analysis. So if you look at the first little schema, if you think of it, on the macro level, or societal level, religious culture is more available than it's ever been. My parents, who grew up in South Boston, God's country, they knew Catholic, 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 Italian Catholic, and so on. That was religious pluralism to us. But now we have cognitive access to so much religious difference now. Now, we might not be heteroglossic in the sense that we can speak about these different faiths knowledgeably, but they're on our radar screen. And they really shape how we hold religious convictions and so on. Second, on the mezzo or institutional level, religious culture is allocated, okay? By that I mean different religious institutions present people with versions of their traditions. One of the books I wrote was a book on American Catholics, and I looked at 6 very different parishes in the Bay Area. None of them presented people with Catholicism. They allocated to the parishioners a version of Catholicism, liberal, conservative, and so on and so forth, okay? And then lastly, on the micro or individual level, religious culture is appropriated. We are not cultural dopes, as Harold Garfinkel famously put it, that we have culture poured into our heads. Lutheranism, Judaism, Catholicism. We are not passive absorbers of culture or religious culture. Rather, we're active appropriators of it. We appropriate pieces of traditions based on the kind of lives we live, who we think we are, and what resonates with those lives. You see what I'm saying? So actually, being religious today is a lot of hard work. In a secular, differentiated society, the religious sphere is untethered from those other spheres, and therefore, religious culture is much more of a melange. It's more available to us, it's allocated and appropriated by us for good or for ill, okay? All right, we good? How many do it? I'm fine. Okay, all right, let's go a little deeper now. So I want to talk about each of these levels of analysis. And I'm telling you, this is why some people don't like to listen to sociologists. It's complicating everything. It is. But if you think about these levels of analysis and how we go about the business of being religious today in ways that we don't always recognize as religious, you'll realize people are doing a lot of inner work that needs to be, as Dan suggested, really respected. Okay? I always say that the opposite of good sociology is not BS, although it does bear a family resemblance. The opposite of good sociology is autobiography, imposing my own norms, my own categories, my own understandings of what's religious, my own understanding of what is spiritual, rather than practicing what we call Verstehen in sociology, which is obviously German understanding. And by that we mean a deep empathetic understanding of the other on the other's own terms. You know? You're a lousy husband, father, sociologist, and Red Sox fan. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because that's not the game she's playing. Okay? Let's go deeper. And when I say it's difficult to be religious, one way of thinking about it is, as we appropriate, there are a lot of unsolved dilemmas that people are faced with right now. And I'm just going to give you some quotable quotes just for some fun, okay? It's a capacious definition of fun, but okay. So when I interviewed, I'm just going to use the case of American Catholics, but the themes I'm pointing out are themes that resonate with Lutherans, Jews, and so on, UNC. So anyway, I interviewed a lot of these Catholics, and it's interesting. They didn't sound anything like their parents or their grandparents. Does that make them less religious, or, as I'm suggesting, differently religious? So I talked to one parishioner, and I picked up they even appropriate different styles of religiosity. And so I picked up these discursive shards, almost like being an anthropologist, picking up a piece of pottery. And you can examine it. You can know a lot from a piece of pottery, the technological prowess of the people that live there, the geographic dispersion of the tribe plan, et cetera, et cetera. And you can learn a lot about discursive shards, things that people say again and again and again. And one of those shards I picked up is, for me. For me. Let's listen in for a second. So I say, do you think the Catholic faith is better or truer than other faiths? Well, I'm only putting this part in because I think it's funny. Dan, didn't you think you were going to warm up? Didn't you say you were going to warm up with some easy questions? I'd hate to be one of your students. They must get sick of you pretty quick. Well, yeah, but I like to think of that as an authority thing. It might not be. You should probably look at that. I guess I probably should. But what about my original question? Oh, right, okay. To put it simply, I'd say Catholicism is the best religion for me. What do you mean by that exactly? I think that if you have a relationship with God, it doesn't make any difference what you are. My feeling is that based on what I know about the tradition and the church and its history, this is where I should be. But one of the things Isaiah says is that God's ways and man's ways are different. He makes that real clear. I don't know a lot about Hinduism and Buddhism, but as far as I can tell, they're synonymous with Christianity, since they're about connecting to God and getting along with other people, and the same goes for Islam. It's about the same kind of basic principles. Interesting, I say, just to buy time. But if that's the case, then why be specifically Catholic? Because this is what works for me. Thank you. I was that person when I was in school too. It's a path I think is working to make me closer to God. Besides, this is a tradition I know and feel comfortable with. Stop for a second. Is it better or truer? I'd say Catholicism is the best religion for me. Why be Catholic? Because it works for me. Think about that. In a situation of religious pluralism, this person, even tacitly, might not even thought it through, does not want to judgmentally underestimate your religious truth or hubristically overestimate his religious truth. Okay? Well, why is that the case? It's because of all the religious pluralism. And we don't just have stereotypical access to religious others. Religious others are dentists, the person who teaches my kid guitar, our neighbors, and so on. So we understand that our way is a way among legitimate others because we actually see these people as religiously different, but good people. Okay? And so these Catholics and other religious folks in the United States are doing a lot of actual religious work in their heads. Okay? The next one. Oh, and by the way, I say this is a dilemma because it's the dilemma of religious pluralism. In other words, what then, if this is true for me and that's true for her, then what is the value of a particular religious tradition? If it's all paths to a single mountaintop, or multiple paths to many mountaintops. My point is, it's a hard one. It's a difficult one. This person wants to feel authentic. It's true for me and not hubristic. That's good, but it opens a question that my parents and grandparents didn't have. It's not an easy one, okay? People aren't asking how many angels dance on the head of a pin. They're asking what's the value of a particular faith, okay? A second chart I just picked up. The good person. It goes like this. This is another, hang on a second. I'm just turning the, and by the way, I read some Bible passages to these respondents, and I read the Matthean Apocalypse about sheep and goats and so on, and so at the end of time. And so I say to this person, what in your estimation does it mean to be a good Catholic? I would say that being a good Catholic in the traditional sense is going to Mass regularly, giving your time and money to the church, praying regularly, and embodying the beliefs of the Catholic religion and how you treat people. I try to do that stuff. Overall, though, being a good Catholic is a goal I'm trying to attain. And since I don't know many of the fundamental doctrines of the religion, there must have been clergy, I mostly do this by trying to be a good person. How does that relate to the last judgment passage I just read to you? When I hear that passage, I'm reminded we're called to do things for other people. I try to do that stuff, but it's a pretty daunting task. I wonder sometimes how good I have to be good. How good do you have to be good? That's a trick I learned in graduate school. Geez, I knew you'd ask that question. I don't think you have to be Mother Teresa good or anything. I think we're called to do those things in the story, but I don't think you have to do them all of them now. I think the story is showing us the ideal that we're supposed to grow towards that. I'm in process. That's the direction I'm hoping to grow spiritually. Is that what growing spiritually means for you? Yeah, it is. I don't think it's about memorizing the Bible or necessarily believing this or that. I really do think it's about being the best person you can be. All right. Great. That's fine. Think about it. Think of the cultural work she's doing. She's pragmatic. I mostly do this, being a good Catholic, by trying to be a good person. All right. It's self-monitoring. It's not easy. I sometimes wonder how good I have to be good. It's an uncharted pathway in a sense. And it's even teleological. It's goal-driven. She says, being a good Catholic is a goal I try to attain. We're supposed to grow towards that, being a good person. I'm in process, she says. Think about it. Think about it. Another dilemma. Okay, if being religious, in this case Catholic, is about being a good person, then the question is, then what's the value of a distinctly religious tradition? If goodness flows from many wells, as a Marxist, as a utilitarian, I just interviewed 518 atheists, as an atheist, I don't know, at one point I was at 517, I'm like, nah, one more. Anyway, as a mother, as a citizen, if you can be good by tapping into schemas and narratives vested in all those things, then what's the value of being religious? Again, no easy answer. No easy answer. But the people who are not in this church, or maybe in the churches I looked at, they're grappling with this stuff. They don't know. Again, we don't care about the angels on the head of a pin. It's 47 if you're curious. But anyway, one more shard I picked up. I didn't pick up the Catholic faith. I didn't pick up Roman Catholicism. I picked up the my faith shard. Here we go. This is also a woman. I remember her distinctly. And I say, do you have a question or doubt the things the church teaches? Of course. I think you should always doubt because that gives you the drive to mature religiously. Questioning things keeps you from becoming passive, becoming like some kind of sheep. Bah, bah. That's how we pronounce it in Boston too, by the way. That's not the sound of a spiritually alive person. We have to question in order to grow. And we have to grow if we want to be fully human. Is that what being a religious person is all about, I ask? I prefer to think of myself as more spiritual than religious. What's the difference? Well, even though I love the beauty of the Mass and the Church's mystical tradition, even though being part of a larger community is important to me, I think privileging spirituality means staying true to the core of Jesus' message and not to all the doctrinal trappings. The Church so often plays by rules and regulations that are outdated and irrelevant, and in the end, these are hateful to outsiders, women, gays, and lesbians, and to the Spirit of God. But we need each other, and we need more of God's Spirit. I think we all have to be on a faith journey, because when people, and I include church leaders here, when we realize how loved we are by God, then we'll love others in ways that far surpass what's outlined for us by the doctrines. It's very intimate. Again, think about it. She says, it's deeply personal to me. I mean, what she's doing in some ways is totally revalorizing, doing a lot of revalorizing. Like, for example, the cafeteria Catholic was intended to be like an insult. And she's like, well, no. She sees it as being a grown-up, as being mature. It's deeply personal to me. It has to make sense to me. It has to jive with my own sense of authenticity. And it requires hard work. Yeah, she's appropriating, for sure, but she doesn't see that in the pejorative sense, a cafeteria Catholic. She sees that as being a grown-up and taking responsibility for her own life and what makes sense to her. By the way, I interviewed a lot of conservative Catholics also. Same thing. They had different things on their theological lunch trays, but they were appropriating very much, oftentimes without realizing it, just as much. Also, she revalorizes this other mantra, this American mantra. I'm not really religious, I'm more spiritual. Look what she does. That's a line. That's the invention of a line. Obviously, spirituality and religion go together, you know. An institution that doesn't have spirituality is dead. And spirituality that doesn't get institutionalized does not get passed on to subsequent generations and so on. Okay? But look what she's doing. She's doing this inner work. The spiritual core of Jesus' message. Religion, doctrinal trappings. Spiritual, love others. Religion, rules and regulations. Spiritual, what's very intimate. Religion, what's outlined by the doctrines. Okay? And she's taking responsibility for her faith. Oh, and by the way, questioning, no problem. Total revalorization of questioning as a religious asset, not a liability. If you were to ask my mother, who's deceased, but if you were to ask my mother when she was alive, hey, are you a good Catholic? And she'd say, yeah, I am a good Catholic. And you'd say, well, prove it, lady. Well, she was no lady, but she'd say, I'm firm, I'm steadfast, I'm convicted. Notice the stasis language. Now, if you were to say to my sister Maureen today, hey, are you a good Catholic? It should say yes. Well, prove it. Why? I question, I seek, I search, and so on. So a total reframing of what it means to question and how that's a religious asset, which is not surprising because we've been taught from the get-go, think for yourself, do your own work, question authority, and so on and so forth, okay? But again, a dilemma. I mean, it's really clear that, it's like a punch in the gut. The locus of religious authority has shifted from what Kant called heteronymous authority, texts, religious leaders, and so on, to the self, autonomy, authenticity, okay? But it's a dilemma. If that's the case, and you do want to take hold of your own agency as a religious person, the question becomes, then what is the value of an authoritative religious tradition? Who can ever call you on your stuff, as it were, okay? So my point is, are these people less religious? Are they bad? Are they, whatever, secular? Well, what's the difference? The secular and the sacred are entwined. I would say they're differently religious because how people engage religious traditions on the macro, meso, and micro level is different. They're doing kind of cultural work to be authentic as Catholics and I would say as Lutherans. But it's not easy because we have older scripts that are not matching their experience. Okay? We do okay? Let me push ahead. On the meso level, I'll go a little quicker this time. On the meso level, I'm saying, religious culture gets allocated. I want to say two things about this. One, there are all sorts of different new types of religious institution now. It's not just the congregation, although there are about 300,000 congregations in the United States still. That's parishes, congregations, temples, synagogues, etc. It's our most ubiquitous nonprofit organizational form, there's no doubt about it. But now, there are other institutional carriers of people's religious commitments and so on. Parachurch groups. Like I wrote a book on Habitat for Humanity, how that is a vehicle for people's religious commitments. Or small groups, often they meet in the basement of churches and so on. About 40% of Americans are members of small groups, whether it be reading groups or spirituality groups or what have you. Even the internet, or even the workplace. So my point is, these different institutions have different discourse rules that shape how people think what religion means to them. Getting your religion from a small group where there's very little crosstalk and no judgment and so on is very different from getting your religion in a congregation, okay? Also, we see how religion is allocated to people in ways that are sycophant on their political sensibilities. We often call this religious restructuring. Nobody ever reads Gerhard Lenski anymore. I love them. He wrote a book in 1961 based on a study of religion in Detroit, Michigan. And he found something, how do I put this? He found something really interesting. He found that if he knew your religion, it was 1959 was when the field work was done. If he knew your religion, if he knew if you were a Catholic, Protestant, or Jew, especially in Detroit at that time, that was predictive of all sorts of things. Socioeconomic class, where you lived, what you did for a living, your opinion on all sorts of, actually how many kids you had, your opinion on all sorts of ethical, social, political issues, and so on. It was really quite a robust finding. If you were a member of one of these three great faiths, Catholicism, Protestant, and Judaism, it was predictive of all those things. But now, I wish I had a whiteboard, but now the most salient line isn't between Christianity or Judaism or the Protestant Reformation line and Catholicism and Protestantism and so on. It's between liberal and conservative now. So a liberal Lutheran, for example, has much more in common religiously with a liberal Catholic and a liberal Jew than she does with a conservative Lutheran. Wow. So that's truly remarkable. And now you see congregations, this congregation might be an exception, I'm not sure, that kind of allocate the tradition in those different directions. Okay? And a way of just kind of imagining this is to look at this little schema. Like, Bob Wucknow at Princeton University talks about these as a spirituality of dwelling. That would have been my mom, right? Stasis language, much more conservative. And a spirituality of seeking. That's like my sister Maureen, much more progressive, liberal, and so on and so forth. And they have different cultural framings for all sorts of things. Self, shaped by religious tradition, or sexual religious preference. Authority, as I suggested, heteronymous versus autonomy. Morality is religion based on, and religious ethics based on obedience, or is it based on what feels right, what feels authentic? Individualism, is that sinful, or is it about self-realization? Spiritual style, we've suggested this, steadfastness versus journeying. Spiritual markers, how do you know you're on the right track? You enlist traditions or doctrines to tell you're being a good Lutheran, or you enlist things like your own personal experience or even service and so on and so forth, okay? My point is that as we're complicating this story, this secular story, and on levels of analysis, as people are appropriating religious traditions in ways that suit them and make sense to them. They're also getting accosted by versions of religious traditions that oftentimes kind of, reinforce their own position in the world rather than challenging it, okay? So, and then people of the same tradition might see the tradition, access the tradition completely differently, because two different Lutheran churches might present Lutherans with a version of the faith, and so people get really good at thinking through that version, and that might attract other people that are like-minded, and vice versa. Last one. How are we doing for time? I think about my inner sense.
You're doing great.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
5 minutes or so.
Oh, okay.
7 minutes?
No, that's good. That's good. I want to open it up for conversation anyway.
Yeah.
And then on the macro level, something is interesting, I think, is happening. And that is, secular identities are now seen as legitimate positions religiously. And I'm just looking at, I can't find my thing, the handout here. A couple of things. One, so I'm saying there's a huge expansion of legitimate positions. It's not just Protestant, Catholic, Jew. It's all sorts of secular identities are seen as legitimate positions. And I'll just be honest. Today, I'm in an interesting position because I interviewed a lot of Catholics for one book and a lot of atheists for another. And the Pope and Richard Dawkins, who kind of thinks of him as a Pope, they would not have a very nice lunch. But every day, Catholics and atheists, Joe Catholic and Josephine atheist, they're very similar to one another in a lot of different ways, okay? So I'm saying, actually, that we have new identities, a way of imagining yourself vis-a-vis religion. And this is the rise of the nuns, not the ruler-wielding, sensible shoe-wearing ones, N-O-N-E-S. Oh, and by the way, I just happen to know this. In 1990, the number of people who said they had no religious preference and therefore was a nun was 7% of the American population. And usually these trends proceed with the rapidity of plate tectonics, very slowly for those of you that aren't geologically sophisticated. But this is a dramatic change in a very short amount of time. So about 29%. So in 1990, it was 7%. Now it's about 29%. Okay? And among those, we have the non-affiliated believers. A lot of people, they might not be belongers, but they're believers. They might not want to darken the door of a congregation, parish, ashram, temple, holy place, and so on. But they're still believers. And then about, so it's about 1 in 5, and about 5% are agnostics, and 4% call themselves atheists. And by the way, there's a lot of stigma around atheism, so there are probably more atheists, but they're kind of closeted because there is, and it's actually really interesting because atheists in this country tend to be predominantly, white, well-educated, male, and usually those things are kind of shields against stigma, and there is stigma about atheists, and maybe it's those folks who are the ones who say, well, I'll call myself an atheist because I can handle it, whereas maybe an African-American poor woman who's an atheist might not want to identify that because she's like, it's tough enough as it is, And then about 8% identify as culturally religious. So, and these are generally accepted religious identities for the most part, even given the stigma of atheists and so on, but still valid options for your kids and your kids' kids and so on. So the Nova effect of religion, the expansion of what's available to identify religiously has grown dramatically. Oh, and I should also, just two things in passing. One, even those other institutions, in those institutional spheres I mentioned, are now sites of sacralization. Art for art's sake, politics, sexuality, work, nature, and so on. So those spheres that we think of as secular are becoming sites where people are sacralizing and doing inner work in these sites. And then lastly, we also sacralize what Charles Taylor in his great 2007 book called A Secular Age. It's not for the faint of heart, but he talks about the modern moral order. In other words, a lot of our values, a lot of our norms, a lot of our taken for granted views of the world get sacralized. People believe in those things, okay? So it's not just religious folks who walk by faith, as it were. I would interview so many atheists, and I'd say, well, you talk about being a good dad, being a good citizen, giving back to the community. Why do those things? Why do those things? Nietzsche would not be happy. There are no, there's very little nihilism here. Well, they actually believe in those scripts, those narratives, those expectations, and so on. So we really are kind of homo credens. We are beings who believe. We believe in a lot of things, just in our everyday lives, that aren't the foundations of which are often lost on us. But we believe them. Like, for example, like an institution like the lecture. We believe in these sort of rules, about talking, about interrupting, about being inebriated, except if you're the speaker, and so on and so forth. So much of the norms and values and practices of our secular culture gets sacralized. Okay? So this simple seesaw model that you've heard, maybe you kind of bought into it and so on, it's not up to the task analytically for being hermeneutically generous and understanding the other on the other's own terms, and understanding all the work and unanswered questions, that people have. And if you don't signal that you're open to those questions, people don't show up at religious institutions. They show up at those places where those questions are not domesticated, but are real questions. And people don't want simple answers, because let's face it, The simple has always been simplified, and the seesaw model is just a simplified story, a more capacious, complicated, I would say, attentive to the complex reality is the kind of story that I'm trying to get at and try to give you analytical tools for wrestling with. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Make me earn it. The hard part is talking to Dan, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've done that. All right, so let me tell them what to do. So probably good to get take a little break, get up from your seat or grab something, refresh your drink, whatever. Then we're going to sit down. Do you want a drink or you're not?
I'm good, thank you.
You're good. All right. You're not the inebriated one in the audience. So feel free to do that, and then I'm going to just ask a few questions based on some of the notes I took, and then we'll open it up to you and see what questions you have, or even insights or thoughts tonight. That was great.
Oh, thanks.
I used to go to the Westar Institute. Have you heard that? Petaluma, a bunch of scholars. They would be out of their institution, so they would just and say anything they want. I go to their lectures. What's the Westar Institute? I'll email it to you. I used to go every year. I don't go anymore. Love it. It's like
That sounds
great
like heaven.
scholarship.
Sounds like the
I would take clergy there. They would destroy all their presumptions.
Yeah.
Right. They're speaking their truth. But anyway, right.
Sligo. Oh, really? That's just south, right?